The Titanic. On the icy night of April 14th, 1912, the North Atlantic looked like a dark mirror, so calm it almost seemed unreal. Aboard the Titanic, carefree laughter and dancing filled the air. Passengers indulged in the euphoria of a voyage considered unsinkable. Yet in the bridge, the first iceberg warnings piled up, ignored at the crew's peril. When the ship's bow finally tore into the ice, the dull thud seemed almost insignificant. Within minutes, water surged into the compartments like a hungry beast. Corridors echoed with frantic footsteps, cries, and sobs, while the crew struggled to control a giant already doomed. On deck, passengers realized the unimaginable. There weren't enough lifeboats. Flickering lights illuminated heart-wrenching scenes of farewells and chaos before going out for the last time as Titanic's bow rose and plunged into the depths. The icy silence that followed was more terrifying than the impact itself. The Lusitania itself. On May 7th, 1915, the RMS Lusitania sped across the Atlantic, believing it could outrun the threats of a Europe at war. Conversations aboard focused on social pleasantries, not the lurking German torpedoes in the gray waters. Yet, U-20 was already on the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment. When it fired its torpedo, the ship had no warning. The explosion was sudden, violent, lifting a section of the vessel in a roar that chilled everyone. Water rushed in, flooding corridors, toppling furniture, and trapping hundreds of passengers. In under 20 minutes, the Lusitania sank, taking with it entire families, elegant travelers, and crew overwhelmed by the speed of disaster. Survivors struggled in waves of oil, debris, and despair as the ocean swallowed the last echoes of the tragedy. The Doña Paz. On the night of December the 20th, 1987, the Philippine seas seemed calm, almost peaceful. The overcrowded Doña Paz sailed through darkness, serenaded by songs, chatter, and the clatter of vendors' bags. Nearby, the MT Vector, poorly maintained and loaded with dangerous fuel, moved through the same waters. When the two collided in an unimaginable blast, a fireball lit up the Black Sea, turning darkness into hell. Fuel spilled, ignited, and surrounded both ships in a fiery ocean that consumed everything. Passengers aboard Doña Paz were trapped almost instantly, struggling against smoke, heat, and the deadly embrace of fire. Those who jumped were swallowed by burning fuel. Within minutes, the ship became impossible to approach. At dawn, only floating ashes and a haunting silence remained. The Estonia. On September 28, 1994, in the middle of the Baltic Sea, the Estonia battled violent winds that made metal scream. Passengers tried to sleep despite the ship's constant vibrations. Just before 1 a.m., a deafening crash shook the ferry. The bow ramp latch had given way under the wave's force. A gaping hole opened, and tons of icy water rushed into the car deck. The ferry pitched violently, hurling chairs, luggage, and passengers into total chaos. Alarms blared, but the list was already too steep for most to reach the upper decks. On the storm-swept outer deck, survivors were at the mercy of cutting winds. In less than 40 minutes, the Estonia sank into the dark sea. Calls for help were swallowed by the wind, leaving one of Europe's most harrowing modern shipwrecks behind. The General Slocum, on June 15, 1904, New York buzzed with families boarding the General Slocum for a festive outing. Children laughed, music played, and mothers arranged picnic baskets, confident in a peaceful day ahead. But beneath the aging planks lurked hidden danger, piles of flammable debris near the boiler. When a spark ignited the fire, flames spread with devastating speed, racing up the decks before the crew could grasp the disaster. Rotten life jackets fell apart in panicked hands. Lifeboats were inaccessible or stuck. The General Slocum became a floating inferno, forcing hundreds, mostly women and children, into the choppy waters of the East River, many unable to swim. Screams and calls faded into silence as smoke rose, leaving a tragedy forever etched into New York's history. The Costa Concordia. On January 13, 2012, the Tyrrhenian Sea was calm. Too calm when a low rumble shook the Costa Concordia. Passengers had settled in for a festive evening, unaware that their cruise would become a steel trap. It began with a reckless maneuver, a salute dangerously close to the coast. The ship struck rocks near Giglio Island, tearing a massive hole in the hull. Water poured in uncontrollably, corridors tilted, and panic spread as quickly as the rising sea. Evacuation was chaotic and delayed. Families were separated, passengers trapped, and the massive hull slowly tipped onto its side, resting in a surreal, nightmarish position. On shore, searchlights revealed shivering survivors struggling to comprehend how a perfect cruise could become total disaster in under an hour. The Express Pearl. On May 20th, 2021, off the Sri Lankan coast, the Express Pearl silently carried chemical containers, one leaking nitric acid, a silent threat turning the ship into a floating bomb. Smoke rose from the deck, and the crew quickly realized the fire could not be contained. Flames spread container to container, creating a chain of explosions that lit the night in orange bursts. The ship, shaken by blasts, spewed molten plastic and toxic chemicals into the ocean. The Express Pearl burned for days before sinking slowly into a poisoned sea. More than a shipwreck, it was a major ecological disaster. Tons of plastic pellets spread along beaches for miles, marking one of the most devastating maritime accidents in decades. The Sultana. In spring 1865, as America slowly emerged from the Civil War, the Sultana steamboat carried hundreds of Union soldiers recently freed from Confederate camps. Exhausted and hungry, they crowded the decks, dreaming of going home. Designed for 400, the ship carried nearly 2,000. Overworked boilers strained under the pressure, and one exploded in a deafening blast. Flames erupted, consuming wooden decks in a sinister crackle. Many were thrown into the cold river waters. Others were trapped in fire. The Sultana burned completely, lighting the night in an apocalyptic blaze. Despite the magnitude, the disaster was nearly erased from history, overshadowed by the political turmoil at war's end. The Mont-Blanc. On December 6, 1917, Halifax harbor bustled when a strange rumble echoed. The SS Mont-Blanc, a French cargo ship carrying explosives enough to devastate a city, slowly advanced. No one expected a minor collision to trigger apocalypse. When Mont-Blanc collided with another vessel, thick smoke rose. Curious residents gathered at windows. Then, in a fraction of a second, the largest pre-Hiroshima explosion tore through the city. A fireball obliterated homes, overturned trains, and shattered thousands of windows. The shockwave claimed lives instantly, and a wave engulfed the harbor. Halifax was unrecognizable, devastated by a maritime accident that became a citywide cataclysm. The Kiangya. In December 1948, as China was engulfed in civil war, thousands fled Shanghai aboard the aging Kiangya. Crowded with families, soldiers, and refugees, the ship sailed unaware of the lurking danger, a forgotten World War II mine. When it struck, a cataclysmic explosion ripped through the bow, sending debris and passengers into the night sky. Water poured in, splitting the ship in two. In darkness, thousands cried for help, fighting for the few intact lifeboats. In minutes, the Kiangya vanished, leaving one of the deadliest maritime tolls in modern history, a tragedy shrouded in silence and mystery. 11. MV La Joola. On September 26, 2002, off the coast of Senegal, the Atlantic seemed deceptively calm for a vessel as overloaded as the Joola. Designed for about 500 passengers, it carried over 1,800 that day. Students, families, soldiers, and merchants, a floating microcosm of the nation. On board, some played cards, others napped, while a few sang to pass the time. Beneath the calm surface, trouble was brewing. A sudden gust swelled the waves, tilting the ship slowly. At 11 p.m., a sinister crack echoed through the hull. The ferry lurched violently, throwing passengers and cargo into a maelstrom of metal and screams. Lights went out, panic spread. Those trapped inside had almost no chance. In under 5 minutes, the Joola capsized, overturning to float upside down, leaving only its hull visible. The dark waters became a silent grave. The sinking was so fast, so total, it left the country in unending mourning. RMS Empress of Ireland. On May 29th, 1914, in the thick fog of the St. Lawrence River, the RMS Empress of Ireland cautiously made its way forward, its hoarse whistle slicing through the humid air. On board, 1,477 passengers expected a peaceful voyage to Liverpool. Somewhere in the mist, the Norwegian cargo ship Storstad also navigated blindly. When they collided, the impact tore a gaping hole in the Canadian liner. Frigid river waters rushed in at terrifying speed. In less than 14 minutes, the Empress of Ireland listed and sank, claiming more lives than the Titanic would later lose. Passengers, caught asleep and unprepared, had barely time to react. Those who reached the deck faced icy black water that stole breath and strength. That night, the river swallowed the ship. the cries and the hopes into impenetrable darkness. Toya Maru. On September 26, 1954, Japan was hit by a typhoon of unimaginable fury. Winds howled, waves towered like liquid walls, yet the Toya Maru ferry pressed on between Honshu and Hokkaido. On board, hundreds, families, business travelers, students tried to stay calm, unaware that typhoon number 15 would become one of the deadliest of the century. The first wave struck and the ferry began to tilt dangerously. Cars and crates slipped, engines struggled. Then a massive wave hit the hull, shattering windows and flooding the decks. The Toya Maru drifted, unable to resist, and another wall of water nearly capsized it entirely. The crew fought desperately to evacuate, but chaos reigned. The ship sank into a raging ocean, nature's brutal power leaving no mercy for those aboard. Sewol. On April 16, 2014, off South Korea, the Sewol ferry carried hundreds of students on a school trip. Laughter and excited chatter filled the deck as cameras clicked. Below, poorly secured vehicles and mismanaged cargo made the ship unstable. When it took a sharp turn, a metallic groan shook the ferry. In minutes, it listed dangerously. Passengers, thinking it was a normal maneuver, waited for instructions. None came. Loudspeakers only gave confusing orders to stay still, trapping hundreds of young people in cabins. Water flooded corridors, screams replaced laughter. Outside, rescue operations hesitated. The Sewol tipped and sank beneath the surface, leaving a nation devastated. The tragedy became one of South Korea's deepest modern scars. Princess of the Stars. On June 21, 2008, a super typhoon threatened the Philippines as the Princess of the Stars sailed onwards despite weather warnings. Darkening skies and whipping winds battered the decks, but on board, passengers clung to hope. As violent gusts struck, the ship creaked under the waves' pressure. A ferocious storm engulfed it, tossing it like a fragile toy. Water poured through broken portholes, flooding lower decks. The ferry tilted dangerously. Passengers scrambled for exits, only to be pushed back by the storm. Within minutes, the Princess of the Stars capsized, trapping hundreds inside the overturned hull. The typhoon, Frank claimed everything, leaving the ocean merciless and unforgiving. Wilhelm Gustloff. On January 30th, 1945, in the freezing Baltic night, the Wilhelm Gustloff struggled forward, crammed with more than 10,000 people, wounded soldiers, terrified civilians, women and children fleeing the advancing Red Army. The air inside was thick with human heat and anxiety, while outside, deadly cold reigned. When the Soviet submarine S-13 fired 3 torpedoes, no one aboard realized the descent into hell had begun. Explosions ripped through the hull, hurling bodies and crushing entire compartments. Panic spread instantly. Staircases became choke points as crowds desperately sought the icy decks. Lifeboats were insufficient, frozen, impossible to launch. The ship tilted, capsized, and sank into the freezing dark. Cries were swallowed by the waves and cold. This became the deadliest maritime disaster in history. SS Eastland. On July the 24th, 1915, docked on the Chicago River, the SS Eastland prepared to board employees for a festive outing. Families dressed in their best, children excited, music and laughter filled the air. But the ship hit a fatal flaw from its construction: chronic instability. As passengers crowded the upper deck, the vessel began to list slightly. A minor shift in the crowd, an imperceptible movement, and the ship toppled. In seconds, under horrified eyes, the Eastland rolled onto its starboard side, trapping hundreds in suffocating cabins. Screams echoed through the hull as rescuers struggled to break through. Unlike offshore shipwrecks, this disaster occurred mere meters from the dock, leaving no chance for escape. The murky river became a theater of absolute chaos. Yarmouth Castle. On November the 13th, 1965, under a starry night off the coast of the Bahamas, the Yarmouth Castle sailed calmly. Passengers slept peacefully, unaware that a small fire had started deep within the ship. At first, it was just a faint smell of smoke, barely noticeable, but the fire spread quickly, fueled by flammable materials and outdated safety systems. When it reached the corridors, everything ignited at once, turning the ship into a floating furnace. Alarms sounded too late. Passengers, startled awake, faced hallways transformed into tunnels of flame. Some tried to reach the upper decks, others searched for non-existent exits. Lifeboats were difficult to maneuver or unusable. Flames climbed above the masts, casting an eerie orange glow over the sea. The Yarmouth Castle burned through the night, drifting slowly until only a blackened skeleton remained at dawn. A fire born almost by accident had destroyed everything in its path, leaving behind tragedy and devastation. MV Bulgaria. On July 10th, 2011, the MV Bulgaria sailed the Volga River, carrying families, musicians, and tourists eager for a peaceful cruise along Russia's legendary waterway. Below deck, worn engines struggled, and a breach in the hull allowed water to seep in. The ship was not designed to handle such a heavy load. When a storm arose, the Bulgaria began to list dangerously. Within minutes, strong winds tipped the ship and water poured in through open portholes. Chaos erupted, musical instruments floated, passengers scrambled through flooded corridors. The vessel suddenly rolled onto its side before almost instantly sinking into the murky Volga waters. The disaster happened so fast, just 2 or 3 minutes, that nearby boats could barely react. The river swallowed nearly everyone, leaving only a handful of stunned survivors amid scattered debris. Sao Luiz. On January 28, 1988, the Sao Luiz ferry navigated Brazil's Amazon River, following its usual route between riverbanks. The journey seemed routine. Families, workers, and street vendors packed into the aging but essential vessel. Yet that morning, an unusual overload weighed down the ship. Suddenly, a tropical storm erupted, sending waves violently rocking the Sao Luiz. Passengers tried to brace themselves, but every movement further destabilized the ferry. A loud crack signaled disaster. The hull gave way under the pressure. The ferry overturned almost immediately, throwing men, women, and children into turbulent, dangerous waters. Many became trapped beneath the flipped hull, lost in a dark underwater maze. Outside, current swept survivors away, while rain hammered the surface like an impenetrable curtain. The Sao Luiz disappeared quickly, leaving the river silent once more, as if the Amazon itself wanted to erase all traces of the tragedy. If you like this type of content, feel free to watch the next video that is now appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us your suggestions for the next video in the comments.